Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. While explicit discrimination in the workplace isn't reported in the large numbers it once was, and considering the multi-billion-dollar diversity training industry, workplace inequality is still very real, with employees of color, particularly black workers, remaining less likely to be hired, stalling out at middle levels, and rarely progressing to senior leadership positions. And yet we tell our children that in order to succeed in life, they need to be prepared to take leadership positions, to take their proverbial seat at the table. But how can they take that seat when there are none available? With all of the advancements we have seen in education and civil rights, why is there still no room at the top for people of color? In her new book, our next guest says the reason can be found in what she calls gray areas. The book, Gray Areas, How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It, takes a deep dive into how racial inequality persists in the workplace. Today, we welcome award-winning sociologist and author, Dr. Adia Wingfield, to the classroom. Dr. Wingfield, welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, no, it's really our pleasure to have you here because, again, this is a very important topic. As I mentioned, we send our students to school, to institutions of higher learning and try to get them into the best schools so they can get the best education and be in the best position to take these positions of leadership, only to find when they get there and they're ready for it, they're none available. So why is this? What's leading to that discrepancy?
Well, a lot of what I talk about in the book has to do with the different ways that becomes part of how we're working today. And when I talk about the gray areas, I'm thinking about what we might consider the additional parts of work that aren't just embedded in the core basics of what you do for a job. So my job as a professor, I'm required to teach and do research and do some university service, but there's a lot that's not included in that core part of my job that still relates to how we work. There are the social aspects of work, the cultural dynamics, the relational aspects. And those are what I think of as the gray areas, how we learn about work in the first place, what types of jobs are available, how we navigate an organizational culture in an institution, and how we understand opportunities and possibilities for advancement and moving ahead. And a lot of the implicit norms and assumptions behind each of those areas operate in ways that really work to Black workers' disadvantages. And that's what I try to tease out in the book. So
you mentioned that these gray areas have to deal with culture and relationships and so forth. Now that's looking at this through a lens of professionalism, through the workplace. Do those gray areas kind of show themselves in the classroom as well, so that would directly impact students?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in the book, I focus more on what happens at work, but I do talk some about some of the ways that those patterns are set for some of these workers when they are in educational settings. In particular, there's a worker that I talk with who I refer to in the book as Constance, who's a scientist, and she talks a lot about her process of education and school and the relationships that she was able to develop and the connections that she formed as a graduate student, and how trying to reform those connections on her own once she landed in her job proved really difficult, and how those difficulties were exacerbated by being a Black woman in this very heavily white male-dominated STEM environment. So I think there are some ways that we see the groundwork being laid at school in ways that then have implications for what happens when people go out into the workplace.
When you mentioned the story about Constance, but I know there were a couple of other stories as well, especially the one with the, I can't remember her name now, well, the name that you use for her now, the journalist, when that she got her background because her father's a journalist. So she kind of learned the ropes through him. But as you pointed out in the book, we don't always have those opportunities. Like, we don't have the father, the person who's in our household who we can look up to, who's going to show us the ropes. And whereas our white counterparts have all those things, or they have at least that generational income that would allow them to take those non-paid internships that, like, she ended up doing. So where can we hone in, or how can we tell our students this is the way to go, although we may not have the resources to support you in those areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that question about how those networks and connections are formed is really critical when we think about the opportunities and access that people have to different spaces. There's research that suggests that over 70% of jobs now are landed because people know someone who's able to give them a foot in the door and they have those connections. But one of the points that I also make in gray areas is that, as you said, when it comes to Black workers, very often we are either underrepresented in those networks, or if we are in those networks, we are less likely to get a referral and less likely to be pushed forward for certain jobs and certain opportunities. So I think when we think about how to rectify that, I think it really comes from those who are on the inside, so to speak. I think it's really incumbent for people who are networked and who are connected in various ways to think about how they can diversify their networks to be more inclusive of Black students, Black workers, Black people in general, and to be cognizant and intentional about putting them forward as potential referrals for certain jobs.
And I think one of the chapters actually discusses that directly, as far as, and again, forgive me that the name of the chapter escapes me, but it was where going from hire to hiring, or something to that effect. Talk to us a little bit about what that really entails, so that once you get your foot in the door, and then it's your turn to hold it for somebody else.
Yeah, that was a really interesting segment to write. The respondent that you're talking about was Amalia, and she was a journalist. And she was also the same one who talked about having a parent who was a journalist and how that helped her to be more aware of the landscape of the field. And so she describes being in an organization where she did move up to a point where she had some responsibility for hiring. And the company where she worked did say that they wanted to focus on diversity and that they wanted to be a place that was attuned to these issues. But she also found that when it came time to do the hiring and to try to bring people in, there was a lot of scrutiny, there was a lot of close oversight, there were a lot of questions asked of the Black writers that she tried to bring forth that she noticed were not asked of white writers that were being put forth on the platform and given opportunities. And that created a real feeling of dispiritedness for her, because she was able to see in real time and very up close how these inadvertent patterns and behaviors can make it more difficult for Black workers to get a foot in the door, even though she was one of the people who was trying to crack open the door to give them these opportunities.
And along those same lines, and kind of parallel to that, is a story about Benedict and how, I guess, at his law firm, he was in charge of some of the younger attorneys, the associates who were coming on, but he was looked up his strategies and his techniques. While they mirrored the same strategies and techniques of his white counterparts talking to the white attorneys, he was doing that same thing with the Black attorneys, but he was scrutinized for it. So talk to us a little bit about that dynamic and how that really impacts our upward mobility.
Yeah, his story was also a really telling one, because he described to me sometimes being very hard on Black lawyers that he mentored and being very open and explicit with them when their work disappointed him and when he thought it could be better and when he felt their writing needed to be clearer. But a lot of his point was that basically this is necessary, but I know that they won't get this feedback from my white counterparts. They'll dance around what they're doing wrong, or they'll be very obscure, or they won't be very precise, or they won't be hard on them when they need to hear it. But then they'll go and talk in closed door meetings and say, well, his work is not up to par. His writing is not good. We can't justify keeping him on. But no one tells the workers in question that these are the issues. And this question and this point of scrutiny that you raised, I think, is really the consistent thread here, because we know from data and research that for Black workers, they are much more likely to be very heavily and highly scrutinized at entry points, when they join organizations, when they are trying to work. And a lot of that scrutiny leads to disproportionate sanction, punishment, and consequences for things that may or may not even be considered wrongdoing, right? So it's easy to look from the outside and say, well, you know, if Black workers aren't advancing and if they're more likely to face more punishment, it must be because they're doing something wrong. But if you think about the fact that Black workers are facing this additional scrutiny, if people are focused only on them looking for mistakes and highlighting things that might or might not be against company policy, then eventually you either will find something or you'll fabricate something that justifies the pre-existing ideas that you already have. And that's what I found to be the case for a lot of the workers that I've interviewed over the course of my career. This heightened scrutiny really has an impact.
And, and I think that heightened scrutiny, as I kind of alluded to at the beginning, trying to make the comparison between the workplace and the classroom, that heightened scrutiny finds itself in the classroom as well, because, again, the research shows us and the numbers show us that Black children, Black boys specifically, have a higher percentage of referrals, discipline referrals, than anyone else. So because they're scrutinized more. Every little thing that they do is being looked at and magnified, even though they're just doing child behavior.
Right.
They're doing child appropriate behavior, but because this young man happens to be 6'3" in the 7th grade, he's looked upon a lot differently.
Right. And that was going to add as well that we know when you mentioned the person who's 6'3" and in a certain grade, we know that for Black children, they are also much more likely to be construed as adults, and they're much more likely to be seen as older and more threatening and intimidating than they are. They often do not get the benefit of the presumption of childhood, right? We saw that happen with Tamir Rice, for example, in the terrible case of him being shot by the police, that the immediate assumption was that he was a 15 or 16-year-old when he was a kid playing in a park, right? But there's infrequently this tendency to see Black kids, as people who are innocent, who are children, who need protection, who need care, love, and guidance. There's much more of a tendency that's documented by research to immediately construe them as adults and people with malicious motives.
Now, I know the Supreme Court just had that recent decision regarding affirmative action, but as it deals or it has to do with the college setting. But can that decision impact the workplace as well?
I think it already is. And the way that it's impacting workplaces is that we are seeing companies already pulling back on their attention to and comfort with focusing on issues related to diversity and inclusion. Even though the decision, as I understand it, the letter of it does not directly impact workplaces, even though there may be future court cases that focus on workplaces. But we are already seeing companies pulling back on their diversity outreach and their diversity initiatives, and doing so because they are afraid of litigation and because they expect that they are likely to get sued.
It's funny that you say that. So either way, kind of, there's the potential of some kind of lawsuit, whether they're being sued because some people feel that they're being unfairly treating minorities and people of color. Then you have the other side where they're not giving enough opportunities to minorities and people of color. So I think that it kind of puts them in a bind almost. But I mean, do the right thing, right? That's what we are. I mean, do the right thing. But then I think that's where we also become this quote unquote colorblind society, or at least that's how people try to phrase it.
Right.
But when we talk about that, and you talk about the businesses who have adopted this colorblind ideology, what is the danger in that?
Yeah, so that's a great question as well. The idea behind colorblindness is that when companies take this cultural approach where they don't want to talk about, draw attention to, highlight, address anything related to race, the presumption is that this then presents a neutral environment and that everyone can focus on their jobs and they can just do their work, divorced from any of the realities or issues related to racial stratification that exist outside of that space. The problem with that is that organizations are not divorced from racial inequality. They are not spaces that ever can or will really be race neutral. And the result of this is that not talking about and not openly attending to these issues of racial inequality means that it's very easy for these same issues to persist, and to persist without strategies or approaches or attempts to try to address or resolve them. And I saw that we mentioned Constance, one of the people that has some feature chapters in the book. I saw that with her a lot, in that the company where she worked certainly posited itself as a bit of a colorblind space, and they were very uncomfortable with addressing and talking about things related to race. But what that meant for Constance, again, as a Black woman in the STEM field, where she was very much in the minority and felt very isolated, the types of challenges that she faced never got attention. And that wasn't for want of her raising them. She was very clear about how racial bias impacted the way that her proposals were received, the ways that students interacted with her, the evaluations that she got at the end of the semester. But there was no space and no framework in her department to talk openly and honestly about that reality. So it just got ignored.
You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is award-winning sociologist and author of the book, Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It. Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield. A lot of these, we just talked about this whole colorblind ideology because everybody nowadays has this EEO statement, the blanket EEO statement at the end of their applications and so forth, that it doesn't discriminate based on all these things. But yet in practice, I think they still do. And that's why I say, again, at the beginning, I stated that the explicit racism and discrimination may not be reported as much, but you still have a lot of the covert discrimination that takes place. And I think that, again, that's where those gray areas come in. So how?
Yes, exactly.
Go ahead.
No, I got excited. I was going to say that's exactly what happens, right? And one of the things that motivated me about writing this book is what seems like a paradox, this idea that we've had a Civil Rights Act. We have, on an objective measure, had tremendous progress in many ways when it comes to race and racism in this country, particularly in terms of the more explicit legally sanctioned forms of racial discrimination that had been a part of our history for a long time. And I think sometimes that lulls people into a false sense of complacency and security. And they think, we have this whole civil rights movement. This is done now. Things have been good. We had a Black president, right? We're set. We solved all these problems. But when it comes to workplaces, what we also know is that even though it is illegal for companies to explicitly discriminate and to say openly, we're not going to hire Black people, we're not going to hire women, we're not going to hire people of color, companies cannot legally say that anymore. And they will post statements just like what you described to say we are equal opportunity employers, we want to diversify, we want to see applications, and we want to be a place for everyone. What happens in practice is what happens through these gray areas that I described in terms of how companies go about finding workers to hire and how they leave certain workers out of that process, how companies establish an organizational culture that is built around norms and values and assumptions that are constructed usually with white workers in mind and ignore the realities that Black workers have in these environments, and how companies go about setting processes for advancement and upward mobility that, again, are not designed with the realities of Black workers' experiences and often result in them being overlooked, marginalized, or sidelined when it comes to their opportunities for promotion and advancement. In the book also, you quote the Roman philosopher Seneca, and that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Now, other than the entrepreneurial opportunities that Black people have succeeded at over the years, what are some of the other spaces that we can actually move into where the kind of to combat some of the obstacles presented by these gray areas, and so that we can take advantage of those opportunities when they present themselves? Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the people that I write about in the book is Brian, who's a film executive. And that's the chapter actually that references the Seneca quote, because he was hired into his executive position at a time when there was a lot of attention in the film industry around diversity and around the Oscars So White campaign in particular, where no people of color were nominated for any lead roles, for any of the lead Oscars that year or the following year. And what ended up happening, just a little bit of a spoiler for people who have not read the book yet, but what ended up happening with Brian was that despite the company's promises, he found that the promises were not necessarily upheld by the reality of what happened when he got hired, and he ended up pursuing other opportunities, particularly in a Black-led production company. So I think his experience is really telling because it's consistent with some of what we are starting to see with some leading Black figures. I think about someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones, for example, who had intended to go to UNC Chapel Hill until they started changing the terms of her employment and revoked her offer and ultimately reoffered her the position. But at that point, she decided to go to Howard University instead, a historically Black college, and pursue employment there. And certainly UNC's loss was Howard's gain. So I think that Black workers are starting to be more cognizant of opportunities to work, not necessarily in entrepreneurship in terms of launching their own business, although that is a trend that we also see, but thinking about ways to move into spaces where there are Black leaders in visible roles and Black people in high-ranking positions who may be able to set a different tone for company culture and one that recognizes what their experiences are. I know that you state, and I think there's a chapter in the book as well, a piece of the chapter in the book as well that talks about movements matter. And you talked about Oscars So White and Black Lives Matter and a couple of other movements that are out there as well. But have we experienced this phenomenon that movements do matter, or have we really just seen a series of moments
that kind of quickly lose traction?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I'm not sure that those are either ors. I think that both of those things are happening. I think we've seen examples of ways that movements have concretely mattered. I mentioned the civil rights movement earlier. That was a clear example of a movement that certainly shifted culture and laws in very specific ways. More recently, we can talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think there's data that does document that it had concrete consequences for policing in certain areas, particularly in cities where there was a visible Black Lives Matter movement. So we can point to examples of ways that movements did have measurable, tangible consequences. But before we get too comfortable with that, it's also important to remember that throughout American history, if we think about the racial dynamics that have been present in our country, every time we have seen movement progress, we have also seen significant sustained backlash. And that's true if you go back to the country's inception, right? We can think about the Civil War and Reconstruction and what happened after Reconstruction, which was this backsliding towards Jim Crow segregation that was very explicit and very harsh. We can think about the civil rights movement and what happened in the 80s when we start to see a rise in the criminal justice system in terms of over-policing communities of color and underinvestment in urban areas where Black people were concentrated. And we can think now about seeing the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 and how we are seeing this retrenchment in terms of laws banning critical race theory and attempts to censor books and companies pulling back on their investments on diversity and inclusion. So I think that movements matter in making certain types of change, but they also have a really limited shelf life. And that shelf life often isn't long-term, and gains that are hard won through these movements can easily be snatched away by what happens afterwards.
Now, I don't want our listeners to think that, we're just rehashing everything bad that's going on in the world and in the workplace and everything. Well, I mean, yes, we're bringing light bringing light to these ills, but the book goes even further than that. And I think that's what separates the book from a lot of other books that are similar to it, in that you propose some solutions. And I think at the end of each chapter, you have takeaways and like improvement checklists that are directed towards certain people. Why did you select those particular people to target, the DEI practitioner and the executive, the HR director, and your colleagues?
Yeah, that's a great question, too. The thinking there was that I wanted to think as broadly and expansively about what various sets of people and hopefully various categories of readers can take away from this book. I think in sociology, we have a very fatalistic tendency to point out a lot of problems. We're very good at doing that, and we are not always as good at identifying solutions. And I did not want to leave people reading this book and, like you said, feeling dispirited and feeling as if I'm just trotting out a bunch of terrible things and finishing the book and thinking, I shouldn't have read that. This has ruined the rest of my day, right? Because there are things that I think companies can do. There are things that I think people in different roles and organizations can do. And it's important to make sure that there are solutions that are being offered and put forth for leaders, for DEI workers, for HR workers, and for everyday workers who I hope will read this and think, okay, what can I do so that my workplace doesn't have to be a place where these gray areas are such a problem and such a challenge for my Black coworkers?
Now, of course, we can understand that, okay, the DEI practitioner, the executives, the HR directors, they're in positions of leadership. So the information that they get or being targeted, they're going to implement things, and it's going to hopefully it'll have that trickle down effect. What kind of impact, or how can we approach our colleagues about this conversation? Because again, politics, religion, and equality seem to be the taboo topics to talk about in the workplace. So how can we broach this subject with our colleagues?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, a lot of this comes from leadership. And it's hard for me to envision a company that makes strides on this front without leadership's active involvement and investment in wanting to see these solutions happen. But when I think about what can happen for everyday workers who are part of a company, I think there are three things that I would suggest that correlate to the three sections in the book. So when it comes to this question of hiring, I think it's important to be a reference. I talked a lot about how people find jobs because of the connections that they have, but those connections often are tilted in a very particular direction. But people can address that. You can develop racially inclusive networks, and you can refer Black friends and associates in your networks to people who are looking for jobs. When it comes to organizational culture, you can be an advocate. You can speak up explicitly and openly in support of company efforts to provide racial diversity. And equally important, you can speak out when others are deriding that effort and make an explicit comment to the effect that it is important and it is valuable and it is something that is necessary for the organization to be as strong as possible. And when it comes to advancement, I think it's key to be a sponsor. It's important for people in those roles to seek out opportunities to empower the next generation of Black leaders and to identify people that they can help move through the pipeline and that they can help support and move into leadership roles. So I think when I think about what people in companies can do to push these things forward, I think it's a question of going to other workers in the company and saying, there are a couple things that you can do. There are opportunities that are available for you. And they don't always have to be kind of big, major structural changing things, because we're all individuals and we all can do what we can do individually to try to see some of these changes happen.
What is it, or how can we kind of overcome, when we talk about networking, how can we overcome some of the barriers to networking? Because the idea is to get the most highly qualified person. And so we have a lot of people. You mentioned a couple of names of people who ended up going to Howard. And I mean, you went to your beloved Spelman and so forth. So you have highly qualified people attending these HBCUs, but we really don't always get to know, or they don't get into those spaces that belie their achievements. So how can we change that? How can we make sure that all the people who are qualified, who have attended schools like HBCUs, or maybe even those second and third tier schools that aren't Ivy Leagues and right below that, can get a fair shake as well?
Yeah, and this is a question for people who are in company leadership, who are actively involved in the hiring process. And research and data has shown us that when people who are in those management roles and those hiring director roles actually visit and spend time recruiting at HBCUs in particular, that actually is shown to have a marked increase on improving racial diversity at the hiring level and later on at the company level writ large. And the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. Often what happens is that when people go to these HBCUs, they see exactly what you described. They see a wealth of talent that they had no idea existed. And they are often really impressed and surprised by this enormous array of people who are just brilliant, hardworking young people who have skills, who have talents, but may not necessarily be plugged into the networks that they already have, right? And I think there's been a long tendency in many companies to assume that looking for excellence means going to the Ivy Leagues, right? But we also know that the Ivy Leagues do not have proportional representation of Black people among their student bodies, right? It's not a coincidence. And I will say this with the acknowledgement that I did attend Spelman and it was a fantastic place and I love it. And I'll tell everybody that. But the HBCUs also have a reputation, and data has documented that they graduate a disproportionate number of people who go on to get advanced degrees, who go on to get graduate degrees, who go on to move into leadership roles, right? And we have some examples of that today. Kamala Harris, Raphael Warnock, Stacey Abrams. These are all products of HBCUs, and they are exemplars of what HBCUs produce. But it's critical for companies to start getting those HBCUs on their radar so that they can see that firsthand, because those aren't always networks that they are already plugged into, and they've got to see it for themselves.
Well, we need to do a part 2 of this conversation. I think
I would love that.
We need to really do, because there's way much more we can go into this, and that 30 minutes will just not allow. But we would certainly like to thank our guest today, award-winning sociologist and author of the book Gray Areas: How the Way We Work Perpetuates Racism and What We Can Do to Fix It, Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield, for coming on to our show today.
Thank you again for having me. This is great.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.